Chinese medicine Qigong, what is it? Okay, I'm Robert Coons. Welcome to Qigong Project. This is my YouTube channel. We talk about Qigong here. Obviously, I've been practicing and teaching for more than 20 years, and I want to make a channel which explains the actual nature of Qigong, what it's all about, what the different styles are about, the mechanisms that make it work. And the kind of benefit that you can get from Qigong. So we have to talk about every kind of Qigong. Chinese medicine Qigong is the topic today. So if you've ever read any like introductory books about Qigong, like the Root of Chinese Qigong by Yang Jingming, for instance, you might have come across the saying that there are several styles, so several like big categories of Qigong. Okay, so there's Taoist Qigong, Buddhist Qigong, martial arts Qigong, folk Qigong, and Chinese medicine Qigong, right? Those are the major, supposedly the major categories of Qigong. And you may wonder, well, what does this mean, right? Are these different styles? Like, is Taoist Qigong like a style, or Buddhist Qigong is like a style? Chinese medicine Qigong is a style, or what's going on with that? Because that might not entirely track with, if you practiced for a while, what you'll find out, right? There's things like individual styles like Kunlun Qigong, Zhineng Qigong, Xianggong, etc., it's a Wudang Qigong, etc., right? There's all these different styles, and it seems like those don't necessarily come with Taoist or Buddhist or medical advertising, right? Most of them are just sort of like, we just call them Qigong. So what's going on there? If you went to China, could you learn Chinese medicine Qigong or Taoist Qigong, and what would that entail, right? So I want to do my best to try to explain these things as much as they are as possible. Okay, now, like, look, I lived in China off and on for quite a number of years. Right now I'm in North America, but I've really put a lot of effort into like learning modern and classical Chinese. Spend a lot of time in the community doing things, right, et cetera, et cetera. But the caveat here is that I'll do my best to be as accurate as possible, but I can't promise 100% accuracy. This is a very deep subject. But I'll do my best for you, okay? So when we talk about these categories, like Chinese medicine Qigong, Taoist Qigong, Buddhist Qigong, etc., really, actually, they're not styles. They're categories, right? So they're genres of Qigong rather than individual styles. And sometimes those genres have styles within them. So you could say, in the context of, I don't know, like Buddhist Qigong, okay, as an example, there are some Buddhist organizations that have Qigong routines, or Taoist Qigong. There are some Taoist organizations that have Qigong routines, like Wudang, for instance, has quite a number of different Qigong routines that are, related to their branch of Taoism in some way. And so in this way, yeah, okay, there can be styles of those things. But Chinese medicine Qigong is really unique in that it's not a style of practice, it's a way to view practice. And I think the same is broadly true of Taoist and Buddhist Qigong as well, and martial arts Qigong. Because typically, when you look at like what Taoism, Buddhism, martial arts, and Chinese medicine are, these are different categories of ideas, right? So Taoism and Buddhism in China are basically religions. They're religions which have philosophical elements. They're religions which have secular elements and folk elements, etc. But they're basically religions, okay? And so when they practice Qigong or Qigong-like techniques, these are generally done with some part of the telos of their religion in mind, right? Some part of the end goal of their religion in mind. So, for an example, Taoism has always been historically very interested in nurturing life energy, right? They call Yangsheng, nurturing life energy, and extending life, right? They call Changshou, right? To extend longevity. And so a lot of these, Taoist quote unquote Qigong techniques are related to ways that we cause the body to become more healthy so we can extend life, right? This is a good example of Taoist Qigong. Buddhist Qigong, on the other hand, it's a little more of a complicated subject, but broadly speaking, Buddhist Qigong, again, is often associated with health practices. So if you look at the oldest examples of Buddhist inner cultivation from a Qigong perspective, they come from the Tiantai sect of Buddhism, which was active about 1,500 years ago. Actually, it's still practiced in Japan today. But in the Tiantai sect of Buddhism, they practiced inner cultivation techniques which were medical in nature. The idea being to help people get over illnesses that they might have, or to help people to become healthier and practice a form of sort of preventative medical exercise. So that's one of the views of Buddhist Qigong. Another view would have been a more recent one, the I Ching Jing, which is sometimes claimed by Buddhists and sometimes claimed by Taoists, right? This particular practice, I Ching and Shi Sui Jing, or the tendon changing classic and the marrow washing classic, right? These are perhaps sort of physical exercises that will allow you to get into a state in meditation where you can meditate for longer, more successfully, right? That's another sort of genre of Buddhist style Qigong. But then when we look at, let's say, martial arts Qigong, generally speaking, there's two big ideas going on. One idea is that we're trying to open up the body and make ourselves more able to practice martial arts better, and be more connected. And another idea is that we're trying to heal from potential training injuries, right? So that's sort of the big idea. Martial arts Qigong. And then Chinese medicine Qigong, it has to also be judged according to the unique features of Chinese medicine. So for Chinese medicine Qigong, this is a very difficult subject to sum up in a short period of time, but I'm going to do my level best, okay? So one of the first things that we have to recognize is that this word Qigong is a modern term. It was coined in 1956, or around 1956, as a result of a cooperative effort by a number of experts, including Liu Guizhen, who was these were members of the Chinese Communist Party. This was post the war between themselves and the Chinese National Party, who ended up in Taiwan. And they had, recently been able to completely take over mainland China. And Qigong was born as a project to investigate how to improve public health, right? So Qigong was seen as a form of preventative exercise, or perhaps even having some medical treatment utility, and it could be, spread out to the masses quite easily. So basically, cadres of people were put together, and they were, experts in sort of medieval inner cultivation techniques, experts in Chinese medicine, biomedicine, et cetera, and they came up with what would eventually become called Qigong. And Qigong branched out into a bunch of different styles, right? So in the early days, Neiyang Gong was one of the big styles in the 1970s, Guolin Qigong, et cetera. And in the 80s, there was this giant profusion of different styles, right? So when we look at it from that perspective, inner cultivation practices in any of the major schools of thought, Taoism, Buddhism, medicine, martial arts, of course, they predate Qigong significantly. And in medieval times, they were not called Qigong. They were called by a number of different names, right? So martial arts Qigong practice in past times was called Neigong, inner skill cultivation. Taoist practice could be called like Xiulian, right? Like refining the Tao, Xiu Dao, these kind of things. Sometimes specific names for practices would be used, like Tuna, right? So grasping and spitting, or Tai Chi, embryonic breathing, these kind of things. Dao Yin, right? Leading and stretching. These would have all been, names that were applied to those techniques. They weren't called Qigong in past times. And so for Chinese medicine, this is also true. But Chinese medicine has a bit of a funny history surrounding inner cultivation techniques. So what I mean by that is that in the very, very early days of the development of inner cultivation techniques, which I'm going to call Qigong, accepting that this is anachronistic use of the term, but just for ease of discussion here, I'm going to call them Qigong. So Chinese medicine Qigong techniques originate at some point a long time ago. Okay, that's all I can really say in complete confidence. But having said that, the earliest manuscripts of internal qi practice date back to the Chinese Warring States period, and there are things like the Book of Stretching. There's another text called Abstaining from Grains and Eating the Air. There's another one called the Moving the Breath or Moving the Qi Stili, right? These different texts were explaining in relatively sparse terms how to practice these ancient Qigong methods. In the oldest examples of medical literature and Qigong literature that have been found in the archaeological records, it tends to be the case that medical books were found in the same tomb complexes, so especially at the Ma Wang Dui funerary complex. Ancient Qigong texts and ancient medical texts were found in the same funerary complexes, uh, having belonged to the same aristocrats who were buried in those funerary complexes. And not only that, but also Taoist manuscripts and manuscripts about um, astrology and astronomy, etc., were also found in those places. So what it looks like, at the very least, is that the erudite um, nobility of, let's say, the Eastern Han Dynasty. So we're talking about like uh, around 2100 years ago approximately, um, were interested in all these different genres of philosophy, medicine, inner practice, etc. And they were keeping these books around, whether or not they were actually practicing them. These were part of their family literature collection, right? And so we know that at least people were practicing and thinking about these arts as being somewhat related to each other that long ago in history. And during the Han Dynasty, the first sort of, let's say this, maybe the second dynasty, um, it these practices were often sort of kept together in the intellectual um, sort of way of thinking of that time. Okay, and this persists even farther forward into history to about approximately 500 AD. You see a lot of the Chinese aristocracy being interested in subjects like inner practice and Taoist thought, and so on and so forth. And they were writing these philosophical tracts and stuff like that were about sort of the Taoist way of viewing inner practice, right? So Ji Xiang, who wrote the Yang Sheng Lun, or the discussion of nurturing life, is a good example of that, right? This is a person who was interested in philosophy from the Tao, or the Taoism from the philosophical perspective, and how we could apply inner cultivation to further our practice, to be able to attain the Tao and to be able to attain longevity, right? So these kind of things were around, and the Qigong practice and the philosophy and the medicine practice were all sort of in the same area. Now, having said that, there are some early references to Qigong in medical literature. So the Yellow Emperor Internal Classic has a reference which talks about methods of Daoyin and Qiao. So Daoyin means leading and stretching, and or leading and guiding, right? And Qiao means pressing into orifices. So what this sounds like, probably some people interpret this as saying that people were doing, self stretching and, doing their own acupoint massage. But there's another, I think, more prevalent thought, which is that this would have been something like the practitioners were doing a kind of massage where they were guiding the motion of the person's body and pushing into specific acupoints as a way to loosen the body up, which sounds a little bit more like Thai massage or present day Tui Na practice. So my feeling is that even though it sounds like it's mentioning Qigong, it might not be the case. But it mentions other things like, maintaining a sort of meditative or peaceful state as a way to cultivate health, et cetera, right? So these kind of ideas are sort of running around the culture at that time. But the first time you really see a Chinese medicine Qigong manuscript is in the Sui dynasty. So this was one of the really formative dynasties, which I think was a very short dynasty. I think it was in the 500s. But during the Sui dynasty, there was a document collected by the government of that time, which was called Zhu Bin Yuan Holun, which is basically like a book about the treatment for all kinds of illnesses, right? And in that text, there's a pretty comprehensive section of Yangsheng techniques, so nurturing life techniques. And those nurturing life techniques involve a lot of stretching and various types of sort of what we would recognize as qigong today. And this is a topic which hasn't been hugely researched in the English language, but it's very interesting because there's a contemporary scholar named Dolly Yang who's translated the book, at least the Yangsheng section of the book, and she's been giving a series of sort of mutually participatory classes through the nonprofit I work for, Dao Yi. And so we've been going into the text. It's really, really interesting. And so that text could be viewed as being a collection of, let's say, Qigong exercises from the Chinese medicine perspective. However, after the Sui dynasty, this idea of giving prescriptions of Qigong for specific illnesses didn't progress greatly. So there are scant collections of Yangsheng materials in the Chinese medicine historical canon, but there's not a huge amount. And so this kind of was something that it was, perhaps part of Chinese medicine, but not as important as acupuncture and herbs and so on. Whereas Qigong techniques really flourished in Taoism and flourished to some extent in Buddhism, and then later in martial arts as well. So that's one thing to keep in mind, that for a good long section of Chinese history, Qigong practice wasn't hugely important in medicine. But having said that, going toward the 20th century, up through probably through about the 18th, 19th, and 20th century, well, 18th and 19th century, some Chinese medicine texts started to borrow Taoist techniques and incorporate them as sort of inner cultivation practices. I can't remember any specific names off the top of my head, but there's a few of them, and they're basically borrowing Taoist Qigong techniques into medicine for the purposes of self-care, basically. So this was certainly something that started to happen more often. But by the time the 20th century came along, there's a couple of key points to be aware of. One of the key points is that Chinese medicine did not flourish under the leadership of the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party of China, because the leaders of the Kuomintang were seeking to modernize China, and I think that their impression was that Chinese medicine was an anachronistic practice, and it wasn't, or archaic perhaps would be a better word, and it wasn't, really of great effect compared to biomedicine, et cetera, et cetera. So they kind of put, they kind of slowed down the progress of Chinese medicine. But after the Communist Party came into power, there was a great emphasis on Chinese medicine that developed from the 1950s forward, and this part of sort of the idea of self-reliancy that they were promoting, sort of national self-reliancy, right? And then after the 1970s, or perhaps even a little bit earlier, but generally, Taiwan also experienced a major development of Chinese medicine, especially as a result of a campaign of Chinese cultural revitalization, which was undertaken by the Nationalist Party in Taiwan. So there were simultaneous developments of Chinese medicine both in mainland China and Taiwan in that period of time. But ultimately, Chinese medicine became institutionalized in a big way in mainland China. And so there are, universities established specifically for the study of Chinese medicine. They have multiple departments. They begin to also behave in a way that's similar to biomedicine in a certain way. So if you go to a certain level of study, you can study things like pathology, physiology, etc., from the Chinese medicine perspective, and it's very well organized into an academic format. So one of the things that happened was in the late 1970s, Qigong began to be taught as a program inside of Chinese medicine universities. And so I happened to have the good luck of doing a discipleship under Wu Binjiang, who's the president of the Ontario College of Traditional Chinese Medicine in Toronto. And he was one of the first cohort of the first master's degree program in Chinese medicine, Qigong. I have his teacher's book actually right here, and actually it's quite a popular book in English and German. So it doesn't show you what it is on the cover, but the author's name is Zhao Guorui, and so Qigong Essentials for Health Promotion. And So Zhao Guorui was one of the first graduate level um, professors for Chinese medicine Qigong in Chinese medicine Qigong university programs, which I believe that one was hosted in Hebei province. And so, what Chinese medicine Qigong, well, now Zhao Guorui had his own style, right? So his style is called Taiji Shi Wu Shi, 15 postures of Taiji. Not to be confused with Taiji Shi Ba Shi, which is a different style. This kind of Taiji Qigong ideas were very popular in the early 80s. And so Zhao Guorui and the other teachers in that program, they sought to understand Qigong from the perspective of medical treatment. And so what they did was they began to start to formalize a theory of Qigong as it relates to acupuncture and to herbal medicine. And so basically, Qigong uses the metrics of body assessment that we would use in Chinese medicine, like if you're an acupuncturist or a herbalist, um, and understanding illness from the Chinese medicine perspective. And then basically, Qigong techniques can be given as prescriptive measures to assist people with their illnesses. So that was the basic idea of Chinese medicine Qigong at the outset. And so this is organized into various textbooks. It's fairly ubiquitous in Chinese medicine universities in China. It's part of the course syllabus, but it's not something that every practitioner chooses to follow up on after they graduate, and it's not something that every practitioner strongly emphasizes during their study. So, in other words, the majority of Chinese medicine practitioners in China who are working in clinics are not providing qigong as part of their strategy in treatment, basically. Or if they are, it's very minimal. I know a Tuina doctor, for instance, who teaches some generalized stretching exercises for his clients, but this would be sort of similar to what you might get from a chiropractor here, or a physio or something like that. So with that in mind, Chinese medicine qigong is something which is part of the educational background of Chinese medicine practitioners, and it's created as a structure to help people view qigong practices through the lens of medicine, but it's not a style. And this is a really important point, because people who study Chinese medicine qigong in Chinese universities, the qigong techniques that they tend to learn are ones which are part of a broader syllabus, which is promoted by the Department of Sport. So I mentioned this in a previous video, but qigong in the 1980s used to be under the management of the Department of Medicine, or the Department of Health. And then after the 2000s, it's been under the management of the Department of Sport, which means that qigong's nature has changed a lot from being very oriented toward using qi as a way to treat illness and using qi as a way to generate better health, and going toward the practice of using qi as a kind of a physical exercise, which can invigorate the body and help you to loosen up and so on and so forth. Which means that the Department of Sport, of course, is emphasizing physical movement a lot more in qigong practice, rather than emphasizing inner cultivation, so to speak. And so understanding that can help you to recognize, if you were to read a Chinese medicine qigong textbook, which I strongly encourage, it's a great idea. You would see that the practices that they're promoting tend to be things like I Jin Jing, right? The sinew or tendon changing classic, or Fang Song Gong, right? Relaxation skill, etc. Ba Duan Jin, 8 silk brocades, etc. These kind of practices, and those are they tend to be relatively more sort of physically oriented, or if they're mind practices like Fang Song Gong, they tend to be for relaxing the body, sort of similar to autogenic practices practiced in the West, rather than the previous variations of qigong, which were much more about how the mind is used to generate energy in the body. So it's a different kind of principle from traditional qigong. Traditional qigong being initially among the folk, and then becoming popular for a couple of brief periods of time between 1956 and 1969, and then between like 1978 and 1999, for various reasons that we're not getting to on this channel. So this is sort of indicative of the character of Chinese medicine Qigong. And what it means is people who like this and people who study this to try to prescribe Qigong techniques or to do Qigong healing, it tends to be the case that they will learn Chinese medicine Qigong and learn a particular style. So as an example, they might learn like Xianggong or, say like Wild Goose Qigong or something like that. And they'll apply that particular style as their main practice, what they teach, what they use to treat people's illnesses, but they'll use the medical understanding that they have to be able to properly prescribe techniques in order to help people practice, right? And to help people to recover from their illnesses. So that's really the structure and function of Chinese medicine Qigong. There are certain techniques that are taught in textbooks, like, certain breathing techniques, etc. And the classification of Qigong in Chinese medicine Qigong textbooks tends to be very, very good. It's much clearer than the structure of Qigong in traditional styles or Taoist textbooks, because they're looking at the practice from the perspective of the specific utility of individual parts of practice. And so Chinese medicine Qigong tends to break things down into pretty easy to understand components, like breath practices, physical stretching practices, things like standing stake or standing post practices, visualization practice, right? Mental focus practice, etc. And it'll take each of those categories and isolate them in teaching so that people will understand what are the categories and what are the specific practices within the categories and what do they do. So this is a really strong point of Chinese medicine Qigong. For instance, like if you were to learn breathing techniques from a Chinese medicine Qigong textbook, then you would see that there were some breathing techniques which might be good for things like relaxation or lowering heart rate or lowering blood pressure, whereas there are other techniques which might be better for invigorating people or, causing their heart rate to increase or, causing their blood pressure to increase. And you would understand that there are certain contradictions in prescription, just like with drugs, where if you were to give the wrong breathing technique to a person, it could hurt them instead of help them. So you would want to target the right technique to give to them so that they would be helped by the technique. And so that's kind of the strong point of Chinese medicine Qigong, is that by breaking down the categories of practice and understanding them according to their utility, and also understanding them according to how they affect people in different kinds of situations, then it makes it easier to pick the right practices. And I think that this is a really, it's really the strong point of Chinese medicine Qigong, okay? And that can really, really help people a lot who already have some basic understanding of Qigong techniques. So if you had come to Chinese medicine Qigong from a different style, this would really help you a lot to be able to understand the style that you do a lot better. But having said that, at the same time, it's not so good for people who have no experience, because they come to Chinese medicine Qigong and they see a bunch of categories of techniques and a bunch of very sparse practices, but they don't get a system that they can take with them and practice and get better at over time, right? So that's the drawback of Chinese medicine Qigong. It requires you to practice another method, really, to be able to get good at Qigong enough to be able to apply it. And then, obviously, Chinese medicine Qigong also has the quality of looking at illness from a Chinese medicine perspective and applying technique in order to treat illnesses specific to, how Chinese medicine understands illness. So that's also a really good point. But having said that, the reason why I made this video actually is because I think that one of the things that can happen if we read these really great, really amazing old textbooks about Qigong written in English, where you can see there's all these different genres like Taoist Qigong, Chinese medicine Qigong, etc. You might someday ask yourself, well, hey, like, I've heard of Chinese medicine Qigong, but are there any styles? Like, who could I study with, right? And so there are a number of people in the community who purport to teach Chinese medicine Qigong, and that's fine, right? Okay, I'm not trying to make any claim that they're not. If you teach Qigong from a medical perspective and you are able to use the principles of Chinese medicine, then it is Chinese medicine Qigong. But that's true for any style. So that's not a big problem, right? So if a person teaches or practices Qigong according to Chinese medicine principles, it's Chinese medicine Qigong, period. Doesn't matter which style you're doing. But there can be a problem though, and one of the problems comes from a sort of essential misunderstanding of what the Qigong and inner cultivation community in China is actually like and how people actually practice. And so sometimes we see people, well, I'll give you an example. When I was in college, um, we would take a Yangsheng class every morning. And the teacher who taught the Yangsheng class, a really, really great person. I really like that teacher a lot, one of the best teachers in our college. But I remember the teacher mentioning that their grand teacher, okay, the teacher of their teacher, um, was doing a specific style of Chinese medicine, Qigong, and that he had traveled to Chinese um, clinics and colleges doing Chinese medicine, and he had retaught the art back to those Chinese colleges and those clinics. And this was some sort of great achievement because the original Chinese medicine Qigong had been lost, and then he had brought it back to its original source. And I remember at the time, I hadn't obviously developed as much knowledge about Qigong as I have since then. But at the time, that sounded wrong to me, having been practicing Qigong for a long time already at that time and having met a lot of, really accomplished practitioners. And I didn't take it up with him because it's not my character. And besides, it's everybody hates that person that argues with the teacher and slows down class, right? But it sat wrong with me for a long time. And eventually I found the piece of information that really helped me to understand why that was such a wrong statement. And so the reason why it's a wrong statement is, I think, because people have a tendency to imagine that all of the best qigong styles are really old, right? All of the best qigong styles must have a history of like at least 500 years, passed down from some mysterious, wonderful exotic past, right, and so on. And they come down through an unbroken lineage of masters, etc. And by the time they get to us today, they've been secrets for a long time because of certain political events that happened, and so on and so forth. And so you would look at something like Chinese medicine Qigong. By the way, maybe it's true sometimes, okay? But if you would look at Chinese medicine Qigong and apply that view, it would be completely wrong, because Chinese medicine Qigong as a genre is one of the newest genres of Qigong. Okay, just speaking about Qigong, okay? I'm not talking about Dao Yin, I'm not talking about breathing practice, just Qigong. Chinese medicine Qigong really came into the Chinese medicine world in the late 70s and early 80s, right? This was a project that Chinese medicine universities undertook. This development of Chinese medicine universities only happened after Mao Zedong began to rule China, right? So even the Chinese medicine universities, as I mentioned, during the Republic, Chinese medicine was, if not suppressed, at least really, really hindered, okay? And so this idea of Chinese medicine, Qigong, as a unique way of practicing actually emerged pretty recently, almost within my lifetime, okay? And so when people are studying that, they still study it today, right? They read these textbooks when they go through university. If you take a baccalaureate degree, then you're going to have probably a Chinese medicine Qigong course. And I mean, if you're studying TCM, right? And then you're going to be reading the relevant textbook, and you'll learn some of the practices, and you'll have already learned Tai Chi, because kids in China grow up learning Tai Chi in school, different self-massage techniques and stuff like that in school, right? Very common thing. In my wife's high school class, they did facial massage every morning before school in order to improve their eyesight. And so these kind of practices, number one, are inside of the culture on a deep level, and number two, are taught in Chinese medicine universities and have been since, more or less the late 70s. So it's totally outrageous that some, Westerner, by the way, who, isn't fluent in the Chinese language and who didn't spend, much time in China learning those things, but instead learned from Chinese people in other countries, not knocking it. That's how I learned too, okay? But what I'm saying is the idea that that person would come back and share this ancient knowledge with them, and under the name Qigong, and there's this big story about that, which, by the way, is really a self-aggrandizing story, right? It's really a way to get power for oneself this is just ridiculous. Okay, it's totally non-factual, and so that's why it's so important to emphasize the idea that there's no distinct styles of Chinese medicine qigong. There is qigong which is done according to the principle of Chinese medicine, and that's what makes it Chinese medicine qigong. And every style of qigong can do that as long as it uses those principles. So I think that it's really, really important for Western students and teachers of Qigong to engage in some epistemic humility. Okay. Um, it's really important that we learn not to tell these sort of colonizing stories about how, we've learned from some teacher who had the goods and got out before certain political events happened. And as a result of that, we have some sort of secret that, these poor people back in China don't have, and we're going to go back and teach it to them. This is stupid. Okay, this is crazy. If you happen to come across, let's say, somebody in a clinical context who doesn't know qigong in China, the reason is because they didn't choose to emphasize that after their education was over, right? And so it's not that everybody who works in acupuncture and Chinese medicine should be a qigong master and that this is a necessity. This is, if you like it, you pursue it. It's just like if you were, if you live here and you were a chiropractor, you're going to learn a little bit of physiotherapy stuff in chiropractic school. And if you found that your patients were willing to, take the exercises and work with them, then you might practice a little bit of that in your clinic, or you might pursue it even farther by going and, getting some extra education in the field of physiotherapy or some other, self-applied manual method, right? And that's exactly how it works in Chinese medicine clinics in China. So it's very, very important that we don't try to use the sort of manipulative and colonizing perspective when we look at Qigong practice in China. And not only because that's morally abhorrent, it's also because it doesn't accurately reflect the actual nature of internal practice in China. So internal practice in China continuously undergoes transformation, right? It's something that's always changing, always transforming for thousands of years now. And it hasn't maintained the same form. It's kept changing relative to the needs of society, relative to the pressures of society, relative to what people have discovered that have assisted them. And those techniques will continue to change as Chinese civilization moves forward. But the main difference now is that those techniques also exist on a global stage. And the global stage will also have its own effect on transforming those techniques. And to some extent, that transformation may make its way into practice in China. So I'll give you an example. Pang Ming, the founder of Zhineng Qigong, taught certain exercises which are very, very similar to autogenic exercises, which are 19th century European method of relaxing the body through a certain kind of body focus and mantra repetition. I don't know if he took the practices specifically from autogenic exercises, but I know that he studied more than just Chinese methods. He studied really broadly. He also studied, tantric methods and Indian methods, and he was really erudite in the self-cultivation world. And there are a lot of also biomedical ideas that make its way into his system. So it's not that we only need to be influenced in one direction and everything the Chinese way of doing things is the last word about qigong. No, this is an international practice now, and we do have some say in how we practice. I think that as we get better at it culturally, we should have more and more autonomy, and we should also make it transform in the way that we need to transform it. But at the same time, and also we might even influence the broader qigong landscape even in China, right? But at the same time, let's not be too arrogant, and let's try to make sure that we recognize that even though today the term qigong isn't used in the same way it was in the 1980s, because the management of qigong has moved to a different government department, it doesn't mean that people don't still practice in those ways. It's just that where you find them might not be in clinical settings. It might be among the folk. It might be in the Taoist or Buddhist population. There's lots of different places that you could find these practices, but you'd have to know where to find them. And that's a very, very important point, because this can help you understand that many of those narratives, and unfortunately, and I'll end the video pretty soon, but many of those narratives, unfortunately, that were popularized as a result of the Taiwanese Nationalist Party's cultural revitalization campaign, right? So what's it called? The Zhonghua Wenhua Fuxing Huodong, right? The Chinese civilizational cultural revitalization campaign, which started in 1969 as a response to the Cultural Revolution. There was a narrative set in place internationally that the Cultural Revolution had completely eviscerated Chinese culture, and people believed it because they didn't have access to China. And look, okay, let's say the Cultural Revolution was very impactful on Chinese culture, okay, but that being very impactful in a negative way doesn't mean that everything was put to cinders and ash, okay? Because mainland China also had a cultural revitalization campaign in the 1980s after the Cultural Revolution ended, and most people don't know about either the Taiwanese one or the mainland Chinese one. And so it's unfortunately, there's this political narrative that has really sullied people's ability to understand things like Qigong, Taoism, martial arts, or other forms of Chinese culture as a result of political struggle going on in East Asia. And I'm not taking a side here, by the way. Whatever my opinion is, I choose not to tell you, okay? But what I will say is that as a result of this, people have gotten into this really unfortunately sort of ignorant attitude about China, where they kind of infantilize, let's say, mainland Chinese culture, and they sort of make the assumption that all these really important things were lost, and then they're going to come back and be white knights and save the culture. It's really gross, okay? I really don't like it, which is why I made this video, to try to set the record straight about what Chinese medicine Qigong is and why such statements are really ridiculous. I'm going to leave it there. I've blown out enough air already. But I hope you found this video interesting and valuable. And you should respect people everywhere you go, whether you're in China or New York or Abu Dhabi. I don't know how to pronounce that place name. Wherever you are in the world, you should respect people. You should assume that they are intelligent and that they're culturally capable and that they're able to understand their own cultures. And not only that, but that they're also able to learn something about your culture, and that you can have genuine communication with them and really learn from them, and try to get over those biases which have been put in place by things like political struggle or racism, etc., etc. And this will make you a much better, much more educated, and much happier person about every facet of life, not just Qigong. I'm Robert Kuhn's Qigong Project. Like, subscribe. Thank you very much. Good night.